Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. So I'm going to introduce you now, as I said before, we gather the questions and do the Q&A just before lunch. I'm going to introduce you now to Mchael Brophy. He's the CEO of Certification Europe. So a lot of the speakers you've heard from today are implementing and are at the coalface, and a lot of interesting lessons learned. Now we're going to hear from the auditor's perspective.
Thank you very much, Conor. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mchael Brophy. I'm here representing Certification Europe, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about 27001, and the perspective I'm taking is the past, the present, and maybe let's look a bit at what the future may bring for us. But just to pause for a minute and explain why I'm standing here, and why I'm able to talk about the past, the present, and the future of 27001. Well, I suppose we in Certification Europe nailed our colours to the mast of 27001 a long time ago. About 16, 17 years ago, put a lot of time, resources and energy into building the competence to work with information security standards. And that's why we were the third organisation in the world to get state accreditation to operate in this field. And we audited and certified the very first organisation in Ireland to get the standard back in 2001. And since then I've worked with many of the companies that have gone through it, somewhere around 90% of them. And as we've grown with offices now in London, Milan, Istanbul and Kyoto, we've also had the chance over the last 15 years to see how that's unfolded with companies all over the world. Now that's not standing here to make any grandiose statements, it's simply to say that we've had 16 years of watching how organisations like yourselves have implemented it and how the standard has evolved. And so that's a little bit of insight, that unique vantage point we want to bring to the podium this morning. So, in terms of what I want to cover, say the theme is to start by looking backwards. And I think it's very appropriate, actually, on an occasion like this. This is the first time there's been a national standard on 27001. So we can indulge a little as a group and look back over the last decade or decade and a half and see how the standard has dealt with issues and how it's developed. Then what I'm going to do is take us into the present and ask, is 27001 here to stay? And on the assumption that I'll probably say yes, I'll look into the future and then say, well, what's 27001 going to have to deal with in the future? So, stepping back in the past for a minute, I'm going to ask you to roll back with me about a decade. In fact, actually a decade, because there was definitely a sense of déjà vu for me when I was thinking of putting this speech together. Because 10 years ago, this year, in 2006, I was actually asked to come and speak on information security standards at this very venue, ironically in this very room, on this very floor of this stand. And I spoke about what was 27001, as it was then called ISO 17799. And I think it's interesting for a moment just to compare that experience with where we are today. Because back then, when I stood up and made the speech, I was the only presenter in an entire day which was focused on IT and security to speak about standards or to mention ISO 17799 or 27001. And I remember at the time, just like this, when the conference had about 50 delegates at it, I asked, could I show of hands, please, of those who have worked with or were familiar with ISO 27001, and 3 delegates put up their hand. Now, I can also tell you 10 years later, one of those delegates was an employee of Certification Europe, which I didn't acknowledge at the time, so there were 2 delegates out of 50 in the room that had any awareness of international standards dealing with information security. I also checked my slides before coming here this morning, and the slides from that time showed that in 2006, there were just over 2,000 organisations worldwide that had ISO 27001. Now let's bring ourselves forward 10 years to where we are this morning. We're standing here at a conference, not where there's one presenter talking about 27001, but the entire conference is dedicated to 27001, with 150 delegates in the room who have all heard of or are aware of, if not already working with the standard. I checked the figures this morning as well. We've gone from 2,000 organisations worldwide to 24,000 organisations this year certified to the standard. And I won't ask you to hold up your hands, but I'm pretty guaranteed that if I ask for a show of hands, there's more than 2 delegates who have heard of the standard. So folks, that little story is a microcosm of the success of 27001. We've gone from a situation where a single presenter will mention it and no one's aware of it, to 10 years later, 24,000 organisations and an entire conference is dedicated to 27001. So has it been a success? I would say by any yardstick you measure by, yes, the last 10 years have been a success for 27001. But the question, why? What's the reasons for its success? And what I'm not doing is going to try and emulate what the previous speakers have talked about of the success it's meant for their organisations. I suppose I'm taking a much more general step back and speaking in a much broader sense about the standard and having watched it over those 16 years. And the reason I think it's a success, and I will have to explain that picture, is because it's a hook. So what do I mean? Well, bear with me for a minute, but if you were to hang, or if I were to ask you to hang something on a wall, which was probably of middling weight, a picture frame, for example, there is only really one suitable solution for doing that today, which is a hook. And a metal hook has been around for hundreds of years, and it's still the best solution. In fact, if you go to Japan and I asked you to hang a painting on the wall in Japan, and you went into a Japanese shop, you will buy a metal hook like that. Same in South Africa, same in North America. There is one common solution to that common problem of how to hang something on the wall. It's the hook. And if you're into design, it's perfectly designed, it's perfectly functionable, and it does the job excellently. And that, folks, is what 27001 is, still a decade and a half later. It is the solution for organisations faced with that common problem of how to manage information security. It is the hook, and a decade and a half later, no one has come up with a better solution of how organisations should manage their information and protect it. And therefore, it's by no coincidence that 27001 is in Japan, is in South Africa, and is in North America, as well as throughout Europe, because it is the hook for information security. As a sideline, it also has achieved eminently and very elegantly its secondary objective. And if you go back to the original standard, which was a British standard, BS 7799, and read in the intro to it what it was that the founders of that standard wanted, they wanted, and I quote, a common language for information security. That different organisations who don't work together, but who need to exchange information, could realise that there was a common lexicon, a common standard, a common vocabulary by which they could agree that that information would be kept secure. And you know what? Having been involved in those audits over 16 years of standing with my colleagues in Japan or being with my colleagues in Italy and hearing them discuss and go through the audits, I do not speak Japanese, I don't speak Italian, but I do speak 27001. And I could understand that second language going on in the room. It may have been discussed initially in Japanese, but the second language which we were all talking was 27001, a common standard. So, as the standards evolved, how's it dealt with the challenges that have been there? Are we still dealing today, in the present, with the same challenges that were there in the past? And the answer is no. And there are three very clear examples, I would say, where a decade ago, some of the challenges I was discussing in front of a delegation like yourselves are no longer the challenges we're facing. So the first of those, simply attention. A decade ago, information security was fighting for attention. Fighting for attention at the boardroom, from financial managers, from senior managers. It was a subset of IT and was always relegated to there. And if it needed a budget, go and find it out of the existing IT budget. I think it's safe to say that, particularly this year, information security is right on the boardroom table. And I doubt whether there isn't a compliance manager, risk manager, even a senior financial officer that isn't looking at the risks or trying to understand cybersecurity or information security. In fact, if there's anything, folks, we have to watch is that the pendulum doesn't swing too far and it become a fad or the latest hot topic, because that will be its own demise. So don't push things too far, but we're certainly in an era where the pendulum has swung in a much more comfortable direction. The second challenge, and the image is meant to represent an IT department, is that 10 years ago, information security was an IT issue. The IT manager will deal with that. Sure, it's to do with computers anyway. They'll sort it out. And I think it's fair to say that certainly over the last 3 to 4 years anyway, that perception slowly crumbled away. And even the financial managers, the HR managers, the facilities managers realize that they do have to have some role in information security in any organization. And then the third area is, and the image is meant to represent a technical fix. And certainly I can go back to a decade ago when I was sharing this platform with technology vendors and software vendors who, and these are my words, not theirs, were basically saying, buy this box, switch it on, and you're secure. And again, folks, I think it's safe to say that over the last 3 to 4 years, that image has also evaporated away. You cannot buy a technology fix for security. It certainly can help you, but security is a human issue. And when you dig deep enough, each security breach or each security flaw, I would say almost invariably came to human failure, where they weren't trained, they didn't have the proper procedures, or they weren't explained the risks that they were facing. There is no technology fix. Those were the challenges 10 years ago, which now brings us up to the present. So, in terms of the present, is 27001 here to stay? And I would say, perhaps not surprisingly and somewhat biasedly, I would say yes. But there's an onus on me to justify that statement. So, I think it's interesting to watch some of the developments that we've now come across. My first statement would be, there is no second hook out there. There is no competitor. After a decade and a half, no one has come up with a better way of dealing with the challenge of information security. 27001 is still unchallenged. A number of years ago, it would have been Sarbanes-Oxley or SOX. PCI DSS is also there, but they're running comparatively in parallel with 27001. In fact, I think the interesting thing is if you watch what's happened in recent years, when there has been a need for specific sectors to dig deeper and bring in further, more detailed controls for their sectors. So if you look at, for example, cloud security and the need to deal with personal identifiable information, what happened there, folks? Did it come up with a competitive standard that rivaled 27001? No. What actually happened is it developed into 27001-18, a subset of 27000, with the expectation that you get certified to 27001 and then bolt on 27018 if that's your requirement. And that's not recent, folks, actually. Go back about 5 to 6 years again. APACS, which is the British Banking Confederation, when dealing with checkbook printing and secure printing around visas, for example, on checkbooks, recognised again that they had their own standard, APACS Standard 55, that any check printer printing a checkbook for a British bank had to adhere to. Did that run in competition to 27001? No. What APACS did is recognise the framework of 27001 and said you must be certified to that and then apply Standard 55 if you're going to be a secure printer. And that, folks, is the model in which things are going to continue for the short to medium term. I would also say it's here to stay because you can look at a number of business sectors where it is the de facto entry card. And you can simply see that by the organizations which have already got certified to 27001. So if you're involved as a data center, if you're involved in hosting, folks, if you don't have 27001, I would imagine that you're finding it quite difficult to find business, particularly if you want to deal with any government organization or multinational party. It is a basic tendering requirement. So, if 27001 is here to stay, is it going to sit exactly as it is now? Or what are the challenges that are going to come up? What are the areas that we're going to have to focus upon as a standard? And again, I would say there are 3 areas that in the short to medium term, I could see coming on the agenda and demanding more attention than they have done up until now. The first of those is the image up there which says outsourcing. It is in fact outsourcing, subcontracting, or dealing with third parties. Now, for those of you familiar with the standard, you'll certainly be able to point out to me that that's been there in the standard for the last decade, and you're right. However, the onus on it is now changing. And I would say for the last decade anyway, 27001 has been quite an insular standard, an inward-facing standard, where the organisation looks at the standard very much from itself and perhaps from a risk assessment might acknowledge the third parties or subcontractors that it deals with. However, with the change in the standard in 2013, a great deal more focus has been placed on the relationship between the organisation and those external parties. And you'll find through the assessment process that that's going to continue. And again, folks, I'm not saying here that it's simply down to you doing the risk assessment. It's now down to what extent have you gone out to your third parties, to your supply chain, and assessed those risks. To what extent when they say, yes, we've dealt with that, have you tried to validate that? To what extent have you asked them, do they have standards or guidelines or criteria that they can prove to you that they meet? And that's going to be on the agenda, folks, for the next number of years. The second one, and we've already heard it a couple of times this morning, is the General Data Protection Regulation. As the Commissioner said, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, the starting gun has fired and organisations throughout Europe have 2 years to meet the finishing line. Now, there's no doubt over the next 18 months at venues like this, there'll be conferences talking about organisations' requirements to meet these regulations. However, that only tells you what you've to do, not how you've to do it. And that's where, folks, I can predict guidelines being produced showing how 27001, which has been dealing with this for over a decade, can help you align and achieve your requirements under the new EU directive. And the third one, which I'm going to spend a minute on because it's my personal favourite here and it's my little crusade for a moment, or rant, is what the image represents, the insider threat. But I'd suggest not in the way that perhaps you're thinking about it. And this is where I'll just take a moment to explain. If you look at the picture, and you may not be able to make it out, there's an individual there receiving a handful of cash. And the person giving it to him is shrouded in secrecy with a hoodie over his head, depicting a hacker, for example. I believe that if you're looking at threats, there is an emerging threat, and perhaps it's been there for longer than you think. But that image is wrong, because the person handing the cash to the individual may not be who you think it is. How many of your individuals, if they dealt particularly with large amounts of cash, and maybe left the organisation, would be open to be giving data about your organisation to a third party? It's a theoretical risk, and a lot of us could make a judgment, and we'd like to think most of our colleagues are fine and upstanding citizens. However, how many of them would give data to a third party if they were offered 3 to 4 million euros for that data? And okay, we start to reduce or increase the probability of it happening. Now, how many of those individuals would hand over that data if the person asking for it was a government representative or a member of the security forces and was paying them 3 to 4 million to do it? Now, you may look at me and raise an eyebrow. It's been happening, folks. If you go back to 2008, the German Secret Service paid a former employee of a wealth management company in Liechtenstein to give them the data on the high net worth German individuals they dealt with. And they paid him 3.7 million euros to do it. And he did it. And I stress again, it was a government agency paying someone to give him the data. Interestingly, the Bavarian finance minister said it was the best 4 million euros that the German government had ever spent, and they anticipated recovering over 500 million in fines and taxes from those German individuals. Did it happen once? No, it obviously was profitable because the Germans did it again. The German Secret Service did it again just 3 years ago when they got a current employee of Credit Suisse to provide them with the details of high net worth individuals banking in Switzerland. And they paid him 4 million euros for it. So there you go, folks. If you're looking at where things might be going, the insider threat may well be the chance of government departments or state bodies paying individuals for information which they put a significant value on. So, in summary, let me just recap for a second. What I've been saying here this morning is that it's worth indulging for at least 20 minutes to look at 27001 and look at where it's come from. It has, by any yardstick, been a success over the last decade. And whether you judge that by an entire conference dedicated to it or 24,000 organizations around the world signing up to it, it's been a success. I've said it's here to stay because it is the hook on which a common problem facing many organizations around the world can address that issue. And I think it's proven that it's flexible enough and adaptable enough that it can change and meet the demands and challenges that will be facing organizations in the future. Thank you very much.